Hello and welcome to ATARC's Understanding and Planning for Phishing-Resistant MFA webinar. My name is Kirsten Patton and I will be moderating today's panel discussion. ATARC stands for the Advanced Technology Academic Research Center, and we are a nonprofit that facilitates collaboration between government, industry, and academia in order to accelerate technology modernization initiatives. We provide ongoing opportunities for cross-agency collaboration through on-site interaction, learning, and market research. I would like to thank our partners over at Yubico today for helping us put together today's session. And additionally, I would like to thank you all who are joining us today. We hope that you enjoy this informative session, and I would also like to remind you that we love to be interactive, so please send in any questions that you may have for our panelists as they come up throughout today's discussion, as well as answer the poll questions that come up in order to ensure that you receive your CPE credit. And with that, I would like to welcome our attendees to please come on camera and come off mute, and we will begin with a round of introductions. So share with us who you are, what you do, what agency or organization you're representing, and anything else you think may be of interest to our audience today. Let's start it off with Derek, please.
Hi, thanks, Kirsten. Appreciate it. Hi, I'm Derek Mueller. I'm with CISA. I'm a cybersecurity advisor, cyber state coordinator for Pennsylvania, and my roles encompass a lot of areas on the critical infrastructure side. And I'll just look forward to learning from the rest of the panelists and deep diving into what topics we're talking about today for phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication and some of the regs that have just come out.
Fantastic. I'm going to pass it over then to Eric next.
Sure. Hi, I'm Eric Mill. I work for the White House Office of Management and Budget, which is the part of the White House that deals with federal agency operations and technology and cybersecurity. So I work for the Federal Chief Information Officer as part of that. And I focus on zero trust as well as other cybersecurity and technology issues.
Thank you, Eric. All right, let's hear from Grant next.
Yeah, so I'm Grant Dasher. I also work at CISA. I work in the cybersecurity division of CISA on lots of things around identity, for agencies and for other stakeholders of CISA. So I provide, technical advice and help with policy setting and things like that.
Fantastic. And then Jared, of course.
Great, thank you. My name is Jared Chong. I'm the Chief Solutions Officer at Yubico. Some of you may know we rather make this with the YubiKey. But more importantly, we at Yubico co-created the FIDO Open Standard back in 2013, so quite some time ago. And we're really excited to see the adoption accelerate in the industry, but even more excited that this open standard being embraced by the federal government, particularly with Eric's team and Grant and CISA. So really here to share any knowledge on how agencies can adopt the technology, what's in it for them. But we're really excited that FIDO is really given the decision and picking up here all over the world.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. So we're really lucky to have OMB represented here today, actually, because that leads me to my first question, which is around the OMB 2206 mandate and the use of phishing-resistant MFA solutions as part of the zero trust strategy. So Eric, maybe we can start with you. Give us some clarity around what is your definition of phishing-resistant MFA and what is the gold standard that we should all be looking towards?
Sure, and I'm also happy to share this here with Grant if you want to add any color. So yeah, for background, right, for those not familiar, our office, which issues policy for federal agencies, issued a federal zero trust strategy at the top of this year after a public comment phase around a draft last year. One of the main, so that's in OMB memorandum language that's numbered M2209, but it is, our zero trust strategy, and part of that is around phishing resistant multi-factor authentication. And so what we are, that's really designed, as it says, right, a subset of multi-factor authentication approaches that specifically is able to block phishing in the way that it is practiced today. And so it is unfortunately a little common today for multi-factor authentication of some sorts that are not phishing resistant to be bypassed, right? So if somebody sets up a fake website that impersonates a government website that requires multi-factor authentication, and they are successfully able to fool the user into coming in and entering their username and password into a phishing site, they're likely also going to be able to fool the user into entering their TOTP code off of their Google Authenticator app or whatever code they get into their text message. The user believes they're interacting with the real site, and the phishing site can take both codes, both the password and the second factor code, and just use those to go and log in as on the user's behalf fraudulently to the real thing. So that's a growing threat and a real thing that we see, and that is seen all throughout the industry. And so we are focused on making sure that when the federal government implements MFA, particularly for its staff, it's the way it does business and the way that staff come and use services inside of federal agencies, that they are using methods that are technically constrained from falling victim to that, where the user can't be fooled into being phished, even if the user doesn't know what's going on, right? So in terms of gold standards for how that works, basically, any kind of method that is able to do this is going to rely on fancy cryptography under the hood somehow in order to create some kind of stronger binding between the real site and the user's real multi-factor method that can't be messed with by somebody in the middle like that. So in the federal government, we, for a long time, have had a standard called PIV, Personal Identity Verification, that is typically practiced, not exclusively, but typically through the cards that staff are issued when they begin work in the federal government. And those have certificates inside them that can be used for authentication and do provide that phishing resistance. There's not a way for a phishing site to take the interaction with that PIV card and use it to log into something else. The other thing, of course, which I'm sure we'll talk about here a fair amount, is FIDO, is the set of FIDO standards, and on the web, that's web authentication is the web standard for how that works for websites. These are standards that are based on some of the same principles, where there is a cryptography, where when you take a YubiKey or another kind of token, or even a laptop or phone, and you are registering that as your multi-factor method, that there's a cryptographic understanding that is then prevents you from being fooled into logging in with that same thing to another thing. So I'll stop there, but that's how we think about it.
Yeah, let me add a few additional things to situate this with respect to, how the government has traditionally talked about this, because I know a number of members of our audience are long time civil servants and government employees. So as you all know, or many of you know, NIST has issued a series of documents called the Digital Identity Guidelines over the previous, number of years. And the current version of those guidelines has a set of concepts in them called identity assurance levels and authenticator assurance levels, or IAL and AAL. Previously there was a single concept, level of assurance, LOA, that sort of combined these things and some other things together, but that's been broken apart in the current version of the standard. And what we're talking about today is really that AAL piece. So NIST, broke it into 3 types: AAL 1, 2, and 3. So AAL 1 was a password. AAL 2 was essentially an MFA authentication, and AAL 3 had 2 properties associated with it. One was this idea that it has to be a hardware-bound credential, like a physical token with some sort of separate cryptographic module in it, or some sort of separate module in it. And then the second was this property called verifier impersonation resistance, which is similar but not exactly the same as this new property, phishing resistance, that is defined in M2209. So what we are doing here is, OMB has gotten a little bit ahead of the digital identity guidelines, but we've worked very closely with NIST in the drafting of this, and these things are going to converge with each other again as NIST, publishes the updated version of 863, the next version of the guidelines. And what they've said publicly on these panels and to agencies is this definition of phishing resistance that's in M2209 is going to be more or less the definition in the next version of 863. And the government requirement, which was previously AAL2 for all, internal like contractor systems, is being up-leveled to this new requirement, which is phishing-resistant authentication, which takes sort of one of these higher-level properties and pulls it down into the broad requirement. So obviously, PIV meets this requirement, but as does FIDO. And in fact, the distinction in terms of the strength of like a PIV card versus a FIDO card as an authentication factor, the current policy from OMB and the future revisions of 863 will treat those as equivalent from a security point of view. So same message as Eric, but just sort of situated within the context of these other documents that are floating out there. And I know it's a little confusing because like the digital identity guidelines get updated on a very sort of particular cycle, but this will all converge with itself again. It's just sort of confusing right now.
Thank you too for responding to that question. So my next question then, and go ahead and come off mute if you'd like to respond to this, but how important is it for federal agencies to implement phishing resistant MFA based on PIV and FIDO authentication industry standards versus proprietary vendor specific protocols?
So I'm happy to go first there. I mean, you heard in our intro, both Grant and I, we talked about FIDO, we talked about PIV. We weren't really talking about proprietary vendor specific protocols. And though certainly there are other ways to go about creating that, a cryptographic binding that can give you phishing resistance, we're not really in a situation where we have to rely on those things. We, as Jared sort of implied at the beginning, the FIDO standards have been around in one form or another. They've been evolving, but they have been developed for almost a decade now. And they're developed and contributed to by the companies that make all of the major platforms that you would care to name and that you would see in an enterprise environment that human beings would be using. That's a good situation to be in, right? So we are able to point to something that we know is widely invested in, used in both the consumer and enterprise contexts, which is also really important. And so we have been really encouraging folks, and that's why we're also willing in M2209 to call out FIDO and web authentication directly. Right? This really is the direction alongside PIV that we would expect to see agencies going in, just as a matter of practice.
Thank you. Would any of our other panelists like to respond to that or add anything additional based on Eric's response? Jared, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'll add to what Eric said. So from a scale perspective, what's the gateway to or how we work in the cloud, internet, right? You trust it to very few platform vendors, right? Literally three, right? Microsoft with Windows, Google with the Androids, and then Apple with iOS and Mac.
Sorry, Jared, I don't mean to interrupt, but unfortunately, your audio is actually is pretty rough. There's some feedback going on.
Oh, sorry. Is it better now? No,
not really.
Okay, let me let's continue on. I'll come back.
Okay, thank you, Jared. We'll hear from you when you come back then. Okay, I'm going to pop up our first poll question then, but if there is any additional comment any of our panelists like to make, the floor is all yours. But otherwise, we'll go ahead and put up our first poll question, please. And it will be up momentarily. There we go. Okay, if you're at home, what phishing resistant MFA solutions are you implementing or plan to implement for PIV or non-PIV eligible workers? So please respond to the options, which include PIV and derived PIV, FIDO, PIV and FIDO, or other. And we will give Jared a moment to come back here. Jared, can you hear us yet?
Yes, is it better now?
Oh, much better, yes.
Sorry about that.
No, all good. Thank you, Eric, for saying something. I wasn't sure if it was just me, but go ahead.
Thanks, Eric. So what I was mentioning about is that the gateway to the internet really falls into three major platform vendors: Microsoft being Windows, Google, Android, Apple being iOS, macOS. And really, since 2019, all three platform vendors have made FIDO part of their everyday product line, right? So Safari shipping with it, Chrome, Microsoft Edge, and even the platform themselves, and being able to support security keys like a YubiKey or platform authenticators as part of the platform. So FIDO is a mature standard, and it's continuing to evolve to introduce additional use cases. And it just makes sense to invest in an industry standard backed by these three tech giants, and trying to do something else that is not this open standard would run into other challenges in terms of longevity.
So thank you, Jared. Excellent points. Okay, so Derek, I would love to hear from you next. What are the authentication gaps across the federal government that require phishing-resistant authentication that you could speak to?
On the federal government side, I'll even talk federal government, and on the critical infrastructure side and private sector, there's a lot. I know a lot of places aren't there yet. A lot of authentication on the DoD side, you'll have like your basic PIV or CAC or your token card to log in. Industry side, you'll see a lot that have most of it's user ID and password. Some of them are going token based, but they don't really have phishing resistant MFA in place yet. I've seen huge gaps in mobile technology. And I think if I've read correctly before, I think YubiKey is one of the factors. I think Yubico is working on that from what I've read before. I may be wrong, but Jared can chime in on that. You think about with COVID and everything, remote access, think about remote access, not a lot of multi-factor authentication in place there. And I guess on the administration side, you see folks with privileged user access. There really is no multi-factor authentication once you get actually into the systems side of administration. That's lacking definitely. And I guess another huge part, if you think of all throughout the country and world, is legacy systems. A lot of legacy systems out there that can't handle multi-factor authentication. And so we definitely see a lot of that. But really just following your risk management process procedures and going down to your critical assets to your less critical, and trying to see how phishing resistant multi-factor authentication can be implemented or not. And I guess the favorite saying of CISA is more than a password. It's you got to think of it that way instead of just your basic password. You got to think of multi-factor authentication, and then you got to think of phishing resistant multi-factor authentication in those regards.
Thanks, Derek. And Jared, I think Derek kind of set you up to respond to that question as well.
For agencies, I think it's a journey. I don't think that everybody's saying, you can just flip a switch and then don't care about the legacy systems. I don't think that's what, Eric, please chime in here. I think that's what Eric and Sis are saying. I think what we need to think is that we need to have a holistic plan. We can't just say just because it's hard and I don't want to do anything. And so, all the mitigations, which is what I believe is, what you've got to put in place, and the risk engines and things like all need to be in place, of course. But I think as an industry, not just federal agencies, but just as an industry, we have to move. Everybody's got to move into when there are new options available for authentication, we must all move there. And then start to remove the ones that are no longer able to meet the baseline. For example, I think Eric mentioned about getting an OTP code on a phone like that. That's a very low bar for an attacker. It really is. And so until we start to realize that is not acceptable anymore, but again, it's not to just say, take it away and you've got no new options, right? So when there are new options, then we can reevaluate based on new data to say, hey, should we even offer such capabilities anymore? So it's definitely a journey. We definitely, from Yubico perspective, not trying to advocate everyone must switch to flip to do FIDO, but we have to do something now. We can't have less options, like say, take away, SMS-based authentication, but then don't have something else. The good news is that we do have something else.
Yeah, well said. Grant or Eric, does any of that resonate with you all, or anything additional you'd like to add to the question?
No, I think it was, I mean, it was a good discussion. I think that, you know, the situation that large organizations like large government agencies face is somewhat different from the situation that small organizations, whether government, you know, micro agencies or SMBs or some of the critical infrastructure providers face. There's a spectrum. You know, we are trying to go for, you know, I think for organizations that face, you know, high threat actors, like pretty much all government agencies, you know, phishing resistance really is a bar that we have to push for. I certainly think that once you get outside of that area, you know, we're trying to encourage through policy, like allowing phishing resistance as an option, right? So another part of 2209 encourages, you know, public facing or requires public facing systems to offer it as an option in some cases, if they currently support MFA. And so that is, you know, another sort of lever that we're pushing on here. But yeah, no, I mean, I think overall I agree with the message so far.
Great. Thank you for your responses. Go ahead, Eric. Were you going to say something?
Well, and yeah, so I mean, I think what I was going to raise the same section that Grant brought up. So the zero trust strategy that we published and that we and CISA are working on overseeing is 99% focused on the enterprise use case, like how people do work inside of an agency. But the one place where we imposed a requirement on public facing systems is around multi-factor and around phishing resistant MFA in particular, because we know that this is one of those areas where the way that enterprise technology works and consumer technology and logins work are interconnected, right? The patterns that people get used to, the technology that people have available to them in their public life, it impacts what is acceptable inside the enterprise. The things that people are sort of trained and empowered to do at work then impact what people are used to and grow accustomed to and becomes acceptable to do out in the public. And there's also in the particular case of FIDO-based authenticators, particularly, they are designed actually to be reused across contexts. So while agencies might want to impose some requirements about what keys or devices can be used in their environment, anything that somebody gets for work, there's actually really no issue with them taking that token that they get, or whatever laptop or phone they might have, and actually reusing that in a personal context, which is a little counterintuitive for a lot of enterprise IT situations, but is there really just isn't an issue there. So this is one of those things where I think we see change happening. This is really a national and sort of global change that's happening, and enterprise IT needs to in many ways be the most strict, and why we're placing the strictest bar, and enterprises have more resources to bring their employees along with them and help get them to that place. But it is, we also want to make sure that the options are available and that the interoperability is present across those contexts.
I just want to add a key service that the federal agencies have today that's public facing that has FIDO enabled is login.gov. So I mean, it's like this is being embraced in parts of federal service. Obviously, I think more can be done, but login.gov today has FIDO as an option to log in, which I use. So it's exciting, right? So I think more services embracing it would allow, again, for this uniform, more appropriate standard to flourish, both from an end user as well as enterprise perspective.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. So we did have an audience question come through. If you're on the panel and you're able to see that, please go ahead and read through it. Otherwise, I'll read through it momentarily. But I want to pop up our second poll question before I do that. So please put that on the screen.
Yeah, so can I actually take a crack? Oh, sorry, you want to do the poll before we?
No, go ahead, Grant.
Okay.
Folks at home, go ahead and just answer it. But Grant, go for it.
Yeah, so I wanted to answer this question. I mean, so again, it's optional at this point. We're asking you to offer it. But I want to point out that platform authenticators are often overlooked in this space, right? We're not necessarily saying everyone has to have a little key that they plug into their computer. We're not saying that. The standard also works with the authenticator that is built into your pre-existing computer if you're using any of the major browsers on mobile or desktop. And that's a change in the last couple of years as this has been built into these platforms. But a huge swath of the population doesn't know, but is able to register their laptop as a platform authenticator. And so, yes, they need to sign initially to their account one time. There needs to be some kind of a bootstrapping, like when they create their account or when they get a new computer or something like that. So it's not a complete solution, but for the problem of, for certain threat activity like stealing cookies, stealing passwords, phishing people's OTP codes, a huge swath of that can be reduced by leveraging these capabilities. And a recent announcement from the FIDO Alliance, something called Passkey, solves one of the biggest remaining problems, which is the transfer of these things between devices, like when people get a new computer and things of that sort. And so I think there's a lot happening here that is going to render this issue of, but I can't mail someone a key, to be not as big a problem as it necessarily is perceived to be. There are plenty of use cases where the physical key is still important, absolutely. But enabling this ecosystem is not limited to a physical key. There's a number of other use cases, ranging from touch your fingerprint in order to authorize a transaction, which is a very sort of common one that's well supported today by this infrastructure, to sign into an account after your cookies have expired, to other kinds of things that are possible. So that's what I would say on that.
Yeah, and just so I am clear, were you responding to the question in the Q&A box or in the chat?
Question in the chat.
Chat, got it. Okay, so for folks who can't see the chat, I'll just reiterate what the question is. How will Fed agencies scale FIDO availability for public users who are widespread and may not have technology available, such as a smartphone, a laptop with built-in FIDO readers? So that was the question that Tom was responding to. Eric, did you want to reply?
Yeah, actually, there probably is a point adding. One, just to make sure that folks didn't take Grant's point and what I said before, that like for the public facing use case, we're not requiring the public to use phishing-resistant MFA, but we're requiring agencies to make that available as an option so that users who do have that technology or need to apply that security bar for themselves can. The other thing, I would also actually point out that one of the Technology Modernization Fund recently awarded some money to the Department of Veterans Affairs for a few different identity-related efforts. One of them is actually that as veterans go, like there's, I'll apologize, I may butcher this a little, as I'm not a veteran, I'm not intimately familiar with some of these processes, but when veterans come out of service and then become a veteran, and there's a part where they actually go to the Department of Veterans Affairs in person, and receive some login information to various veteran services that VA operates. That's actually what they're going to be doing, is piloting an initiative where they give FIDO compliant tokens to people, including people from all walks of life, socioeconomic status, demographics, et cetera, and are going to see what the effectiveness of that is as well, and helping to raise some of the security for those people, because of course sometimes it is the folks who are most vulnerable, who they may lack access to technology, but also may be preyed upon through account takeover and other issues. So I just wanted to point that out as an area also in the public facing space where the administration's making some investments in trying new things.
Great, thank you. Any other comments before we move on? Okay, so then the next audience question that came through, I'll read it aloud. It's a little lengthy, so bear with me, but the U.S. Access program has been in place for quite some time to support agency-wide PIV deployments across civilian government. Currently, the government does not have a centralized FIDO program that agencies can leverage to deploy FIDO at scale. Are there any plans in place to centralize a FIDO program? Perhaps some consideration given into an auth function under the CDM program?
I think that's a question for me. So the answer, so there's nothing to announce at this time, but I think it's a an excellent observation that there is U.S. access, and it has provided a lot of services to government agencies in terms of PKI and card issuance and things like that, and that there's not a comparable effort around some of these things. So I would just say, I mean, I think we recognize that, and we're continuing to look at what makes sense in terms of strategy, not just for the token, but the broader identity and access management space, right? The other part of M2209 that we're not really talking about here is a desire to sort of up-level the technical maturity of the identity infrastructure as a whole. And a lot of the existing CDM efforts in the identity space have been focused either on privileged accounts or on like very specific things like the master user record and priv, trust, and cred. And those are obviously important, but they're not a complete ICAM solution by any stretch. And there are places, especially with the move to the cloud, that's gathering steam in agencies where I think it's clear that more needs to be done. So I don't have any specific programs or initiatives to announce, but I would just say this is an excellent observation, and yeah.
Great, thank you. All right, so moving right along, Derek, I want to hear from you next. And my question is, what is the importance of additional form factors for authentication beyond a traditional card form factor?
Eric touched on a lot of things earlier in that, where even when you have like a specific card authentication, those can easily be hacked, spoofed. If somebody gains access to an unpatched system, somebody can basically get your certs and basically pretend to be you to log in. So that's the importance of moving one step further and getting kind of moving to that passwordless multi-factor authentication, to where you're going to kind of get rid of what then you're going to have what you have. And I think Grant was talking about a lot of them are going with biometrics. You got facial recognition. There's other forms of that. Think of like perfect example, you go to the bank. Before you go to the bank, they would never ask you for your ID, and then after a while people will be impersonating you. Okay, now they start asking you for your ID. Now what do? They take your picture. So they're getting away from just accepting your signature, and now they've moved into their own form of I guess kind of phishing resistant multi-factor authentication, but they're making it a lot more harder for the criminals and attackers to come in. But that's just an example on the physical side. On the cyber side, it's more in depth than that, when people are trying to steal your identity and get into your systems and other means. But I've seen it on the DoD side a lot, to where a CAC, they're moving away from the common access cards because people were able to spoof those and get the keys off, or the certs off of those, and gain access in encrypted means through email or to various web pages, or even onto systems that they have access with. So I think that's the importance of adding it. There's a lot more to it, which I know everybody else on the panel can get to, so I'll let them go.
Well, thank you, Derek. And Eric, I know you mentioned some things earlier. So is there anything else that you'd like to add, or any of the other panelists? Okay, oh, go ahead, Eric.
Just the high level remark that it's just really important that we we just acknowledge that like people need options in order for this to work. Like in real life, people drop their cards in the ocean, they drop their phone in the toilet, they just get a new phone, right? Things are refreshed all the time. And we live in a high entropy world. So a lot of the ways that even agencies that may be using PIV most of the time, the key word there is still most. There'll be corners of the agency that aren't, or there'll be clear use cases where that requirement drops in sort of unexpected ways to provide some slack in the line. And I think what we are saying is that other form factors and protocols are needed, so that the slack you need to provide in the line is actually just as secure as the line itself.
I would like to add to what Eric said. So the options are really critical. I mean, so one of the things that maybe not everybody knows about FIDO is it's really a self-registration type of protocol. It's really powerful because you can register more than one authenticator, right? So today, just issuing one CAD card, one PIF card is like work, and then two, like thinking about two is like a lot of work. FIDO, by nature of the protocol, is allow for self-registration, right? Which is a very critical piece for scale. What it means is that if you go through what example, like so if you onboard a laptop, you onboard a phone, right? Like so you can have more than one to get to the same. So you can register more than one authenticator. You can have a security key back up the phone back up the security key. You have all these combinations, a lot of flexibility of usage. But more importantly, it doesn't change the baseline service requirement. Like the servers don't change just because you have multiple authenticators. You don't need to think of a bigger PKI setup or something. So by default, this is what this particular standard allows, which is very exciting. We don't have this type of protocol at scale previously. And the second point I want to make on the standard itself is when we think about adoption, it's good to think through the different scenarios, obviously the assurance level, but we have one huge opportunity now, which is I think it's not fully addressed in this conversation, but Grant brought it up, IAL, right? There's this identity verification, and then you have authenticator assurance. Like we need to think about binding this together, because what you don't want to have is you create a very strong identification process. It's a big ceremony, and then you issue out a username and password, and then you onboard a FIDO credential. Like the attackers just zoom into that process and just go to the middle layer and says, you know what, you issue out a temporary password to get to the FIDO. So we need to think holistically. I think this is working on it. Grant, certainly you're working on that. Like we need to bind these things together so we don't drop in assurance level to go up again, because the drop is where the attackers are going to go. So I think that's a big industry effort. It's non-trivial. It's non-trivial for enterprise as well as as a end user's perspective. But we have to solve this binding problem. FIDO allows a huge lever that we can use, and now I think just trying to create policies and guidance about the binding, I think it's work to do. All of us need to do it, but it gives us the ability to do that now, because it was quite hard to do without a FIDO sort of standard to do self-registration.
I mean, just to put a finer point on what Jared is saying, right? Like though in some ways we're talking about something, raising a security bar, which can feel like a constriction. We're also talking about opening the door to using these different things. So the best way to avoid ever having to drop down is to have all these options. It's very easy, it is conceptually easy to imagine a federal agency and an enterprise putting their staff in a situation where the staff they have their PIF card, like they have all these things registered as ways to get into anything the agency operates. They have their PIF card that they can use to get in. They have their phone that they were issued, or a BYOD device. They have their government furnished equipment, their laptop, whatever they may have, and maybe they have a portable token also that they were issued upon arrival, or depending what the role is. You might have people with 4 or 5 different devices that they're able to use to log into their things to do work, without such that, like, even if they don't have access to 2 or 3 of them, for some pathological reason, even in that extreme case, they still have ways to get in without having to go knock at IT's door and beg for an exception to get in and do their job.
Excellent points. All right. So Jared, I want to ask you next kind of a big question. Is the federal government ready for FIDO?
Eric thinks it is. I certainly think it is. Industry has done it, right? So we're talking about coming from industry, building this thing. Commercial customers, enterprise customers have already adopting this at quite a big scale. Grant, as you've known, he came from Google. I mean, we've done this in industry. I think, and industry has very similar legacy things. There's some, you can think of different verticals that have these legacy pillars. And so I wouldn't say it's like a completely simple transformation. I mean, this is, I think, disruptive, if you can think of it from an authentication perspective. But in terms of the tech stack, it's mature. In terms of policy, I think we're there from a maturity level. Implementation perspective, I think there's areas that we can improve because it's every unique vertical has its own set of challenges, but it's something that we've done before. So I believe that it is about kind of the will of all of us to push this forward. And certainly, people looking to Eric and Grant for leadership about how do we get it done, funding, programs, those are the things that help accelerate it.
Thoughts from any of the other panelists?
I mean, a few things. Look, the PIV ecosystem is old and very mature, and it does a number of things reasonably well. And there are certain things it just really can't do that are very difficult for challenges that we face that have led to a lot of this sort of not leveraging it to its full potential, or thinking we're in maybe a better place than we are because of certain constraints like the lack of optionality that we've been talking about. Even things like Drive PIV, for example, the way in which the Drive PIV actually gets bound to your mobile device leaves a lot to be desired from a cybersecurity point of view in some of the implementations. And so I think there are, it's not, from my point of view, it's not maybe not the right question. The right question is like, what is the best way to get to the cybersecurity goal that we need, which is phishing resistance, and what are the tools that we can leverage to get there? I certainly agree that, especially in this space of binding accounts to credentials, there needs to be more maturity in the market. There is a clear and well understood way to do that when your identity and your credential are kind of viewed as the same thing. I mean, that's not technically true with PIV anymore. It was true with PIV at the beginning. Now we've started to decouple it because you had to make the phones work. But there's still this sort of ambient collapsing of those that was a technical simplification that created a bunch of problems, but it did make this piece easier. And so I think that's a gap that needs to be solved, certainly in terms of, I wouldn't say I think the policy is done. I think there's more to be done on the policy side. I think certainly in terms of programs and implementations, experimentation, there's a lot that needs to happen to make us really be able to put a rest on non-MFA and non-phishing resistant MFA, which is widely used. The last thing I would say though is, the legacy systems point, I mean, that's a problem with PIV too, right? It's not like people are using their PIV cards to connect to these legacy systems in many situations. At best, they're connecting to some intermediate thing that either directly with their PIV or flowing through the rest of their identity using federation. That federated model is exactly the same from an application point of view, regardless of if you're using PIV or another authenticator. So like, we've introduced this indirection in the infrastructure, with M1917, and frankly, with the way people had implemented PIV before M1917, at least in the civilian government, we had this indirection in place, and we need to finish the job of actually doing that, of doing SSO, as opposed to just, signing into the applications with passwords. And we need to make sure that the core identity infrastructure is something we can actually trust, right? In the old model of, pre-zero trust, the identity infrastructure, we were still signing into applications, but in some sense, it wasn't the primary defensive boundary. In a zero trust world, it's not the primary, I mean, it is a critical defensive boundary. And I think that, so are we ready for FIDO? I mean, I don't know. Do I think that we need to figure out how to get to phishing resistance, and that will require more options and tools? Yes. And that's sort of what we're trying to enable. This is going to be a journey for sure. And yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Great questions and great feedback. So 2 more audience send-ins. One's more like a statement, but we can discuss that too. Patricia Bates writes in, there are many partnerships and collaborative arrangements. Agencies are sharing data with .edu and other research and commercial entities. There should be a way to have FIDO creds to allow that to continue without dropping assurance levels to partners. Not sure how that could be funded. So that is one comment from the audience. And then a question sent in by Jim Salmonson is, the complexity to centralize identity services for both legacy and modern applications is a continued struggle for agencies. Absolutely, FIDO options help accelerate the adoption for having options beyond PIV. Can CISA and OMB, can you guys provide guidance for agencies that are locked into PIV or nothing policies to embrace the future of FIDO and other options for MFA and zero trust needs with device validation?
You want to take that one, Eric?
Yeah, I mean, this is what we are, Grant, myself, others inside OMB, CISA, and as well as the National Cyber Director's Office. I mean, we are spending quite a bit of time with agencies right now and talking with them in depth about their existing policies, some of which are clearly, to the commenter's point, PIV or nothing. I do think from like a crisp policy perspective, it feels like we have set a pretty clear sort of bar for what is expected, but we are engaging both like verbally as well as getting more into written stuff with agencies to really try and convey like the depth of the work that we know needs to be done to hit this bar. We are absolutely talking with agencies and sharing the viewpoint that we have all been kind of echoing here on this call today, that we've had a PIV or nothing policy in many ways across the federal government, formally or informally, for quite a long time, and we still are where we are. We don't see a practical way forward for the government to hit, for any agency of any size, to really incredibly achieve a strong enterprise-wide phishing-resistant bar with a PIV or nothing policy. And so like we're saying that increasingly directly, I think, in settings like this, as well as to agencies. And we welcome feedback on what else is helpful to get that message across.
The other thing I would just say is, look, we need to prove that it can be done somewhere, like in order to sort of build momentum on this. I think there are pockets, to what Derek said earlier, there are pockets of DoD that have sort of started to do really interesting things in this space. At CISA as an agency, we're trying to do some interesting things. There are pockets in other agencies as well that are starting to explore this. There are gaps in the market that are very government specific that need to be sort of fixed, and that requires demand. So we have a bit of a first mover situation right now. I think that, hopefully this cybersecurity environment, which is forcing us to sort of look at some of the slack, as Eric put it, that we created in order to let agencies' missions be executed and have to start to close some of those holes. I think that will force a little bit of a reorientation in terms of, tooling and strategies to approach that. But yeah, I think this is as Eric has a phrase that I love, the government is a large multi-stakeholder tapestry. And I think that as we're trying to create additional space, on the one hand, we're trying to raise the security bar on the other, and we need help from everyone, on this, attendees and others, to sort of help, work out some of these details and figure out how to really get to a phishing resistant future. I mean, PIV is a totally brilliant technology that was way ahead of its time. And I don't want this call to come off as anti-PIV. I mean, when I first sort of learned about it, 10 years ago, as an engineer, I was just, I was incredibly impressed by what had gone into it. But we've learned certain, issues with it that make it not a complete solution in the way that it was envisioned by its designers. And so we need to complement it with other technologies in order to really get where we need to go. So I think that's what I would say.
I mean, coming from the vendor world, I think that agencies should push their vendors. I mean, honestly, like, why is it that a CMS vendor cannot issue out PIV credentials and FIDO credentials? To me, it's like the technology should make it difficult, right? So if every issuance technology can issue a PIV, can then also do FIDO, then it helps all the agencies overall, right? So the vendors have to evolve to meet the requirement, and I think that's also what Eric is saying, and Grant, like, I think the tech stack should be easy. If the identity provider can issue and provide PIV and FIDO, then the work to do the transitional transformation is so much easier, right? So I think that all of the folks from the agency's perspective, I recommend to push your vendors, especially the IN vendors, to say, look, why is there FIDO on your roadmap? Or why is the FIDO support weak, or whatever it is? I mean, I think especially those that have very invested PIV work streams, I don't think it's that difficult, that FIDO, honestly. It's an open standard. There's so many implementations to implement that in the servers and the backend. I don't think anybody can say, oh, we don't have resources to implement FIDO. That shouldn't be the barrier.
Thank you, guys. So I'm going to make a last call for questions since we only have 10 minutes left. If you have audience questions that you want answered, send them in now in the next couple of minutes or so. And I'm also going to ask for our third and final poll question to please come up on the screen. What is your agency's timeline for implementing phishing-resistant MFA? So if you want your CPE credit for being here, please answer that. And with that, I'm going to ask my next question directed towards Derek. Derek, what are some practical steps that agencies should be taking to adopt and deploy phishing-resistant MFA to meet required timelines?
Yeah, I think what was said before, it's not going to happen overnight. This takes time. Some of it, it's going to require funding. But really, you just start with the basics of basically understanding first, what is multi-factor authentication? I know I said it earlier, but if you think of it in a simple term, more than a password, and then you move on to understanding what regs and stuff are out there right now, looking at the OMB 2209 or M2209, looking at NIST publications, they're out there as well. I think it's the 863 series, 3A, they're all out there. And then also maybe going to the FIDO Alliance page, looking at that, just doing research, educating yourself. So that's the first thing. You need to understand what you're implementing. Second thing is, what do you have in place already for authentication? If you can at least strengthen what you have right now, like I said, going back, a lot of areas have, forms of multi-factor authentication. But like I said, you look at the privileged users and you look at different ways of getting into the networks or on the systems. How can you strengthen that at the, in the meantime? And then you have your plan of action saying, hey, okay, this is how we're going to implement, these various steps for phishing resistant. And, like I said, it all stems down to training and awareness and educating yourself.
Yeah, well said. Thank you. Would any of our other panelists like to respond to that?
Start small, just get in there and start doing stuff, right? So, if you start, if this is the sort of first time that you as an IT team have really come across this technology, then if I was a CIO, I'd be buying my my CIO team a whole bunch of these and telling them to go start using them in your personal life, start find some systems internally where you can get, there may be some systems in your agency also that are partner facing or public facing, could be appropriate for a login.gov integration. Maybe you already have that done, and you can be using some of those things even in your work life. And I think to Jared's point, right, it's not, this is something that enterprise IT is all undergoing together, right? This is a bigger change than just the federal government, and roadmaps are in all different places, and it's got to be something where everybody is hearing the same message that this has to change. And then in fact, some of the things that we are used to doing, whether that's codes like we talked about, or push notifications, the way that some people have become used to getting in the enterprise, that those don't hold up against an attack, and that it's centered. But from a change management perspective, it's more important to begin moving and start making changes than it is to gear up for a big bang, massive change 2-3 years from now.
Excellent points. Thank you. All right. Well, with that, I want to make sure we all have time to share some of our final thoughts. So I want to go around and hear from each of you. What is the main takeaway that you have gotten from this conversation that you really hope even our audience members will walk away with a better understanding that, this is what's very important to understand as it relates to the topic and everything we discussed. So Grant, do you think you could kick us off with that portion of our webinar?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think the big takeaway here is, this is all very hard, right? We've been trying for a long time to get to a phishing resistant future as a government. And I think that, we've realized that we need more freedom to get there than we originally had envisioned. Freedom is not without cost. But I think there's a trade-off here that we've sort of collectively as a government community started to sort of contemplate. And so I think change is hard, change is scary. This is early days, and so I guess my main takeaway and feedback is take a deep breath. It's okay. We're going to work through this all together, and we have a really challenging problem to go out and solve together, but we have to figure out how to do it because the adversaries are not sitting there silently. So that's what I guess I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. We got this. All right, Eric, what's your takeaway?
Well, I might have stolen my own thunder there because I think the last comment I made about change management is one of the takeaways I want to leave for folks. I maybe another aspect is just that it's very easy sometimes inside the U.S. government because it is so enveloping, it is so large, and it is a community. It's actually one of the things that surprised me when I joined the government was the sense of like community and shared experiences that people across agencies have, and that's really powerful and allows a lot of interagency collaboration to happen that wouldn't happen otherwise. It does also create a bit of a bubble, and what has been happening outside the federal government for a number of years are that industry, the security community broadly, which is not just industry, at the significant parts of the enterprise IT field, we've all been moving in, working to, and this is getting into the broader zero trust conversation, right? But like the model of enterprise IT itself is changing, and it's just we cannot be a technology island inside the U.S. government. It's not sustainable. We should be using the tools and technologies that the rest of the world is using so that we benefit from the investments that are being made in those technologies, and so that our interests are represented in the further development of those technologies. Like, this is something where we should be part of the global community on this, and I think that is a part of what's happening. So even though this to some corners of the government can feel like a new, novel, and somewhat disruptive thing, this has been a change that's been coming for a long time and is bigger than the U.S. government.
Yeah, great. I'm hearing a lot about just collaboration with the global community. And Derek, let's hear from you next.
Big takeaway, a lot of information, but the big thing is everybody on the panel here, resources. You can see there's just a few of us on the panel here, Grant, Jared, Eric, myself. You can reach out to anybody. You're not in a bubble. So, if you ever have questions you're confused on how to implement it, where do you go first? You just in this little footprint here, you can always reach. Well, I mean, I know myself, you can. I'm pretty sure everybody else on here you can reach out to in those regards. But yeah, just looking at the SMEs on the panel here and learning a lot of great information in their areas is definitely very beneficial in that. So definitely don't sit there behind the desk afraid to reach out. But that's what my big takeaway here.
Yeah, that's great. Let's learn from one another. All right, and Jared.
First, thanks everybody for joining us. I think the first step about what we're doing is that you want to learn. That's step one. And so to echo Derek's point, I mean, the main takeaway is, from my perspective, is the education piece. So if anybody feels like this is overwhelming, and you need more resources to like get more and repeat, I think all of us are happy to share and educate, because I think the education piece is quite missing overall, and industry included. As Eric said, a lot of security folks are in a bubble. It shouldn't be that way. And this affects all of us every day. Whatever we do, inside, outside government, this is a big problem. And until we look at it as all of us has a part to play to solve this problem, then we're not going to get the scale we need. So thanks everybody for participating and wanting to learn. And we're all here continuing to evolve this for the good of obviously federal agencies, but beyond that as well.
Absolutely. So be open to learning and be open to educating. That's great. Well, thank you all so much for your time today, our panelists and our audience at home. We really appreciate you being a part of this collaborative session. I also want to give a special thank you to Yubico for partnering with ATARC on this and making this happen. So again, I hope to see you all at our next one. I think we should be having yet another poll up here. If you would like to have your CPE credit emailed to you, let us know so that we can get that out there for you. And also just know that our next event that's coming up is on June 28th. It is ATARC's 2022 AI and Data Virtual Summit. So if you enjoyed this program, I think you'll probably enjoy that content as well. You can go ahead and register for that on our website. And I hope to see you all there. Everyone have a great rest of your week.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.